Hello, everybody, and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. My name's Don Arleth, and let's get started. After nearly a full day of negotiations on Wednesday, EU Environment Minister just agreed to cut the union's greenhouse gas emissions by 90% by the year 2040 compared to 1990 levels, with Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic voting against the plan. The agreement delays the launch of the ETS2 system, the emissions trading system for transport and buildings, from 2027 to 2028, following strong pressure from Poland. It also allows the use of international carbon credits for up to 5, maybe 10% of emissions cuts, a move that some critics say weakens the target. Meanwhile, the world has failed to cut greenhouse gas emissions sufficiently to keep global warming within the 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and the threshold is likely to be breached in the next decade. The UN Environment Programme has reported on Tuesday. And finally, I'll mention that the UN Climate Conference COP30 will get underway today in Brazil. And now, here to shed some light on this issue is Sławomir Raszewski, Senior Oil and Gas Lecturer at the University of London. Hello, sir, and thank you so much for joining us on World Talks.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. Now, I guess to start off with this question, what does it really mean for the EU to cut the greenhouse gas emissions by 90% compared to 1990 levels by 2040? How can this affect real everyday life?
Well, that's a very good question. And of course, we are in the midst of the discussions, particularly now since the COP30 in Brazil is starting next week. And I suppose that the marathon negotiations that were taking place on Tuesday and Wednesday between the ministers of European Union countries was very much to prepare to this meeting, but also to make a statement. I think the EU is essentially trying to balance, on the one hand, the demands of its environmental policy objectives. The EU wants to be seen and wants to be an environmental policy leader. And on the other hand, the realities of geopolitics, if you like, in the changing world, particularly here in Central and Eastern Europe. So what does it mean in practice? In practice, it means that cutting further the emissions is likely to have impact on affordability. So while we are focusing on sustainability, the impact might be on affordability in terms of the ETS2 scheme, which is the emission trading scheme, which essentially envisages capping and trading emissions. So essentially, emissions would be allowances to emit CO2 emissions will have to be purchased by a company. In this respect, this is in a very sensitive issue area because, as you mentioned, it's in buildings, it's in transport. So while it doesn't affect directly the consumers, it will affect them indirectly because those who are in the business of fossil fuel use in buildings, in transport, generally speaking, would then pass on the cost on to customers. So this is something in the making. But of course, we're talking about the future, so there might be some adjustments going forward.
Right. And Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski was just on TVP World yesterday saying that, the demands of defense now for the continent, there's going to have to be some give and take when it comes to these ambitious climate goals. Do you agree?
Well, I mean, this is a very sensible assessment, and you can't really argue with this. And when it comes to the negotiations, we know that there is a agreement that should economic situation change, or indeed defense spend, should this affect defense, then obviously some countries, in particular Poland in this respect, reserve the right to adjustments in the future. And I think military in general obviously is one of the major sources of fossil fuels for the good reasons, to keep us secure. So as such, there's, I think, widely shared view amongst those who kind of take this problem realistically, that they should be excluded from those targets.
Now, why did some countries like Poland and Hungary, for instance, vote against the new climate target? And this ETS2 system, I mean, by delaying it 1 year, I mean, is this going to make a big impact? What is the bottom line there?
Well, this is a very good question. I suppose that domestic politics probably plays a role here, and I think that the electoral cycle probably plays a role. So, this is probably one of the factors. The other factor is, as I mentioned earlier on, we are in the midst of changing narratives, if you like. Whereas COP 30. Is expected to bring many people from around the world to discuss climate. We already know that there is a big sort of cloud of skeptics whether it is going to be a breakthrough. We have seen that since COP28. In fact, in COP Glasgow 26 was the beginning of sort of dividing lines globally on the 2050 agenda. Some countries subscribe to that. EU is the example of the 2050 agenda. Other countries which have much greater emissions do not subscribe to that. They believe that this target should be 2060 or 2070 or even more than that. So we see major dividing lines. And of course, on top of that, there are developing nations which obviously would like to see some kind of reparation schemes from developed countries. So we have quite a lot of politics, both internal domestic politics, but also external politics. And I think that it is also a strategy kind of to wait and see. So while 1 year is not a lot, but I think for the EU countries, it is perhaps just to see what is going to be discussed at COP, what sort of decisions are going to be made there, and what sort of critical points will be discussed by some of the key countries.
Now, I'd like to return to these, the ETS2 and affecting buildings and transportation. How is this going to affect everyday citizens? Is this going to make things much more expensive when they do kick in?
Well, by definition, the idea is that you cap and try to essentially establish a maximum amount of emissions that are allowed, and then you try and use the market forces to trade the emissions. So essentially, anyone who is in the business of these two sectors would be supposed to purchase the allowances to continue their business activities. And of course, having said that, this cost will be passed on to consumers. So consumers will ultimately have to pay the price. And this, as mentioned, kind of brings in this affordability debate increasingly so, particularly in those countries who are sort of still developing and within the European Union. Of course, Central and Eastern European countries have been always voicing this as a concern, partially because of their still large dependence on conventional resources. So I think that, yes, your assessment is probably correct. We haven't tried that yet, so we don't know. But from the concept, from the model, we know that this cost will be passed on to consumers.
Yes, and going to this 1.5 degree increase in global temperatures, we've been told for a long time that we could not allow this to happen by the end of the century. Now we're hearing that it's pretty much already arrived. I believe the official estimate is 1.3 degrees right now, and this threshold will be crossed in the 2030s. So is this catastrophic? And if the estimate now is double that to, say, 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, what are we supposed to think?
It's a very good question, and I can probably support my response with a reference to one of the key, if you like, climate policy champions, Bill Gates, who recently made that point, actually said that, well, for most of the people on planet Earth, what is more important is probably the daily life and survival. So, if a child, I'm quoting him, somewhere in Africa is suffering and in need of a vaccine, that's probably more important than 0.5 increase in temperature, Bill Gates said in this interview, which has been widely commented over the past week. So I think that probably the discussion is also changing, because if you look at the grand scheme of things, while European nations are willing to cut emissions, we also have to remember that they outsource emissions elsewhere. And by the way, in this recent negotiation rounds, we know that there is an option for them to outsource certain percentage of their emissions to third countries. We know that the deindustrialization that it has been ongoing is also, in a sense, effectively shifting emissions from European Union to other countries. So, emissions are still taking place because the world consumes more energy, most notably fossil fuel energy, not less. So over the last 30 years, the use of fossil fuels has gone down just slightly, perhaps by 4 to 5%. And yes, we have added renewable energies on top of that, but this hasn't been a tipping point. It hasn't replaced the fossil fuels, or it hasn't even broken even. On top of that, one of the topics which has been covered by the station is the fact that renewable energy requires critical minerals and rare earth metals, which, by the way, are controlled by only a very small number of countries, most notably China. So we also have this geopolitical element here, which I alluded to early on. So this is a big question, and I suppose that we'll probably find out more at COP30. What sort of attitude will this topic receive, and what sort of provisions the communique from COP30 will include, and what this entails to global climate policy.
And that'll be a discussion that we can have next time we have you on TVP World. Sławomir Raszewski, Senior Oil and Gas Lecturer at University of London. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, sir.
And that concludes this edition of World Talks. Thanks for joining us, and stay with us for more here on TVP World.